For those that have not met me, I'm Jessica Fowler. I'm the new education director at the Naval War College Museum, and welcome. Before we begin, I always ask that everybody silences their cell phones just in case. That way we don't have any interruptions during the lecture. If you haven't received the emails about AFALs or any of the other lectures or programs at the museum, and you would like to, we have an emailing list at the back on the table back here. And I like to send out a month out, 2 weeks out, and a week out for AFALs. And then we also have special lectures that I'll send out emails about as well. So if you'd like to receive those, you can definitely send them out. I'll get those emails to you. I would like to thank Seal Newport for allowing us to be here and hosting us for these events. It's a really beautiful venue. Bradley's the director. It's wonderful and really generous of us for allowing us to be here. The next lecture for AFALs will be next month, the usual second Friday of the month, March 13th, the British Battle of the Atlantic. And it's by Evan Wilson, who's a Naval War College historian and professor for the Hatton Army Center. I think that'll be a great one as well. Today, we are fortunate enough to be joined by Chuck Veit. Chuck is the president of the Navy and Marine Living History Association, a nonprofit dedicated to promoting an awareness of the role played by navies in the history of America. He's a frequent speaker at historical societies and Civil War roundtables throughout the Northeast. He has also presented several times at the Naval War College in Newport, here, to the Naval Order of the United States in Jacksonville, Florida, and at the 238th Navy Anniversary Ball in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Please join me in welcoming Chuck.
Well, good afternoon. I too would like to thank the War College for having me back. I've spoken about 6 times before, usually on topics that are less well known, rocket torpedoes, submarines, some Navy episodes and that. Within the whole overall Navy story, there is another secret story that's hidden in plain sight for about 150 years. And that's the role that African Americans played in the Civil War Navy. Our perceptions of their role in the fleet is pretty much forced upon us by their experience in the Army. If you picture the United States colored troops, we read a lot about those, and there are a lot of them. Most recently, of course, has been showcased by the movie Glory, which did a reasonably good job of portraying their experience. They're for about 10% of the Army. Their experience wasn't the best it could be. They are separate and definitely not equal. Compared to white soldiers, their pay is often delayed. When they do get that pay, it's lower by $3. What's more, they're charged for their clothing, another $3. They get inferior medical care, whereas the Navy segregated hospitals by officer and enlisted, no matter what your color was. The Army segregated by race. And the black soldiers didn't get near the care the white soldiers did. They got inferior equipment. The last scrapings at the bottom of the barrel were what the black regiments got. They also obviously fight in segregated units, which till the end of the war are led by white officers exclusively. The assumption has always been, and we encountered this quite a bit, that the Navy experience was the same. Not really so much, and it's all of this man's credit, Gideon Wells. Wells is from Connecticut. He's referred to as Neptune by Abe Lincoln. He likes to refer to 2 secretaries as Mars and Neptune. And Neptune, or well, it's like Father Christmas here, he is a staunch abolitionist. And before we talk about what he does during the war, we have to start back in the founding of the country and see how the Navy treated men of color through all that time. During the Revolution, there was no color line. Black sailors and men of all races served in all 3 of the navies. I say 3 navies because there's a continental navy, which isn't that big. There are state navies. If you're along the coast, you have your own navy. Massachusetts Navy, Connecticut Navy, South Carolina Navy. There's also privateers, which make a lot more money and are a lot safer. You're not supposed to fight, you just steal. So, but there's a lot of people in there of mixed ethnicity. Of course, at the end of the war, we disbanded our Navy. Not only is it expensive, it smacks of royalty and monarchy, and we don't want to do that stuff anymore. So everyone is ushered out of the fleet after the war. Now in 1798, the US Army actually took the step of banning blacks from serving in the Army at all. It's not the Navy's problem, there is no Navy just yet. It's refounded in 1798 for this quasi-war with France. When that war ends, sort of a non-war, there's an economic boom. Upturns in the economy will again and again see an opportunity for blacks to serve in the fleet because whites want to leave the fleet to go get better paying jobs somewhere else. So there's actually an influx of African Americans such that by the time the War of 1812 breaks out, 10% of the fleet is now African American. Strikingly, as the war begins, up on the Great Lakes, 50% of Perry's men are African American, including 360 black Marines that you almost never hear about. How are these fellows treated? Again, I want to stress throughout this, I'm not making a claim that there's no racism in the US Navy. We can't judge these guys out of their time. There's individual racism everywhere, but there's no institutional racism, no bias based on color. This surgeon actually believed that there was simply an absence of prejudice. And a number of officers agreed with him. The color of your skin or the cut of the trimmings of the coat affect your qualifications or usefulness. And no, they won't run, they'll die by their guns. At the end of the war, the Army banned all blacks from serving. The Navy did not. It's illegal. Supposedly they were supposed to usher everyone who wasn't white out of the fleet, but they couldn't do it because they had to have men to man the ships. By about the 1820s, a great quote from a Navy officer saying that the U.S. fleet, there was no finer collection of Huns, Goths, Chinamen, and blacks in the U.S. Navy. It was quite a melting pot. Nonetheless, a few years later, in 1837, there's an economic panic, and whites need jobs, so they limit the number of blacks who can serve in the fleet to 5% to make room for whites to take over those jobs. Now, why is it that the Navy seems to be the job of last resort, along with the Merchant Marine? The subtitle there, "No Dogs or Sailors Allowed," gives you a hint of how sailors were treated. That was put up in restaurants up and down the eastern seaboard. If you came ashore on Liberty, don't eat here. No dogs or sailors allowed. Some of the books that we subject our children to in middle and high school as great literature were actually written as exposés. Both Dana's book and Melville's book were hot topics at the time. No one really realized how bad life at sea could be. We romanticize it in hindsight. The guys that lived through it didn't find it romantic at all. It was grueling. It was said that life at sea was the closest a white man could come to actually experiencing slavery. Your captain or overseer has power of life and death over you. You can be flogged at his whim. You get up in the morning, he doesn't like your face, you spit over the wrong side of the deck, you could be punished for it. You could even be executed. There were ways around the rules. A few too many lashes does the job as well as a firing squad, right? Even though that was rough, life at sea presented an opportunity for black sailors. Because unlike trying to find a job, a steady job ashore, when your husband went away to sea for X number of months or years, it was a steady paycheck he was guaranteed when you get home. You could actually raise a stable family. So it actually was a role that a lot of blacks desired to get, was at sea. Now with that 5% quota, only half of that was actually filled. 2.5% of the fleet is African American by the time the war begins. So there's a lot of room for expansion, and that's critical for Lincoln. We are desperate for men. We actually have gunboats that we have either co-opted and rearmed or built from the keel up, but they're sitting idle for lack of crews. The problem is that only Army enlistments count towards state bounties. When the government said, Rhode Island, you have to send us X number of men, we'll pay you a bounty per man to get them in the Army because they want to rush them to the front to fight. No one said, by the way, send us X number of sailors, we'll pay you the state bounty. There's no bounty for sailors. If you join the fleet, it doesn't benefit your state at all. Again, no bounties for those guys. But blacks are barred from serving in the Army at this point. One stunning article I ran across at one point in Massachusetts later first started to recruit blacks to serve in regiments like the 54. Connecticut actually said they cannot come by train even to Connecticut. You want to go to New York and South, you go out western Mass and down the Hudson Valley. So there's a lot of anger against any black serving in the Army. However, Wells is able to fill that 2.5% quota by enlisting 900 blacks immediately. Now, why can he get away with this? There's a variety of reasons. All those famous regiments in the Civil War, those are federalized state militia. The 7th Mass, the 2nd Rhode Island, the 54th Mass, whatever, the 12th Kansas, those are basically owned by the governor of that state who has loaned them to the federal government. And we just immediately say, oh, they're part of the Army of the Potomac and the Army of the Tennessee. Well, there's a core army, the regular army, which is only about, I think, 10,000 men. Everybody else works for the state. The governors could actually pull them back if they ever wanted to during the war, but didn't. When those guys are recruited, they're recruited from local communities. They usually start their drilling experience on the green in town. Then they'll go to a local camp, which is also within the public view. Had the Army tried to put blacks in those ranks, the public would have known about it and possibly revolted. This isn't just a racist thing. Lincoln was very leery of being accused of wanting to start a slave insurrection. He didn't want anyone thinking he was doing that. So keeping the Army segregated was very important. The Navy, however, owes nothing to the states. It's a federal institution and it does whatever the government wants it to do. When the Navy recruited, you announce in the newspaper rendezvous, French for get together. If I had a rendezvous in Boston, I would attract potential sailors from all 6 New England states, maybe from New York, from Canada, foreigners in the harbor. Everybody comes to the rendezvous, the doctor gives you a physical exam, which was often missing from an Army enlistment, and then you're taken away, sight unseen, to a receiving ship, like old Ironsides. They take the mast down, put a roof over it, and there you learn the ropes, literally. So no one sees who's on board that ship or who's being trained. And what's more, when you go to the front or to serve with the fleet, they don't say, you 52 guys that all came from Newport, you're gonna serve together. No, it's like, I need 12 guys. Yeah, you. So you're split up and scattered and spread apart. So even if you join with friends and family and you're all of one race, you're not gonna necessarily serve together. So the race card is sort of diluted there, and the public is unaware of this. The black community is not unaware of this. Only 10 months into the war, the Liberator, coming out of Boston, has a wonderful quote. Can you fight is the only question the Navy cares to ask. They don't care what color you are. They need the men, and they know that blacks have served in the fleet before. Now, there are two distinct groups of African Americans who served. This was supposed to be true at the time by recruiters. It's been proven by data since then. There are Northern freemen. A lot of these guys, 63%, had experience at sea. The whaling fleet, the merchant fleet, possibly in the federal fleet before. They were enlisted based on their ability and given a certain rank. In the South, you have contraband. Contraband is not a slang term, it just means things are illegal. When Ben Butler down at Fort Monroe decided that slaves were helping the South, not of their own free will, that was illegal, so they were subsumed under the word contraband. Contrabands were believed, and mostly were, of course, ill-equipped to work at sea. They'd been forbidden to learn much of any sailcraft for fear they would escape Southern slaveholders. So most of them will be enlisted at the lowest possible rank. That lowest possible rank is actually called boy. It is not a slur. There are a lot of white boys in the Navy, just like there are black boys. It's the lowest rank. Now, Wells didn't like this, but he had to follow the law. So when he's following the letter of the law, he encouraged his officers to more obey the spirit of the law. So on the books, all these guys were listed as boys. Okay, I've met the law. The local captain's ship actually brought them on board ship, which is a couple ranks up from boy. It's what most guys coming out of boot camp would typically, or receiving ship would mostly enlisted as. So the ship's captains in promoting locally gave Wells all the plausible deniability he wanted to have. So long as things were actually working the way he wanted them to go, it was okay. This episode totally falls out of the history books, and I ran across it by accident when I did my first book. If I ask everyone in this room, what was the solution to the Merrimack or Virginia, you'll all say Monterey. Well, it was. It happened to work out that way. It's a bigger story, though. That was actually Plan A. Plan B was a submarine that wasn't ready in time. Plan C was a small squadron of 4 to 6 civilian ram ships. And if you picture Virginia with her low freeboard, nowadays we think that top deck was actually underwater, so it could strike a ship below the waterline and sink her. Ram ships weren't a bad idea. It might be rough on the two coming in port to starboard because they can turn all their guns on her, but 1 out of 4 is going to hit the ship because Virginia is a slow pig in the water. It takes her a half hour to describe a full come out circle. If you could have rammed her and sent her to the bottom, it wasn't a bad idea. Unfortunately, excuse me, the Army wanted no part of this. They were terrified that Monitor wouldn't work, and what is the Navy going to do? They didn't think Monitor was going to be very successful. So the Secretary of the Army goes out and starts recruiting civilian ram ships. As the ships get down there, it becomes apparent that the white crews who were recruited in New York had not been told what the job really was. They just assumed we're going to run supplies up the river, it could be dangerous, They drill with the great guns and all that, and have pistol and cutlass drill, but nothing ever happens. When they get down to Hampton Roads, Flag Officer Goldsboro lines them all up and says, my brave boys, I appreciate what you're doing, your country appreciates this, go sink to Virginia. And to a man, they basically said, say what? I'm paraphrasing, but that volunteer line is now way ahead of them. And then one crew mutiny. They go back to New York after Goldsboro treats them to every epithet you can think of, but they're civilian, you can't do anything about it. The officers stay, he sends more people up to recruit in New York City, they get a second crew, and they're all gung-ho too until the night before they ship out, they meet the first crew in a bar. Second crew's gone. They're not going to go out and fight Virginia. Now the cat's out of the bag. So the Army desperately goes to Fort Monroe and goes to General Wool and says, can you give us 50 guys, that's all we need. They're just going to do the grunt work on the ship, shoveling coal, raising the anchor, we'll do everything else. He goes, I need 1,000 men. I can't give you any. But there is a pool of people that if you're bold enough to tap into, might be interested. Now, I'll caveat this by saying there's a lot of articles in the newspapers and private letters at this time questioning whether African Americans can or would actually fight. Nobody had seen them do this really since the War of 1812. So I can be a little forgiving when people weren't sure if this was gonna work. 300 stevedores working for pay, free men at Fort Monroe, line up on the parade ground there and hear the talk. And as soon as they're asked to volunteer, 300 step forward. Because it's just grunt work on board this one ship in a mutiny, the Arago. The Navy officers picked the 50 biggest guys. They're gonna be shoveling and hauling lines and that, and they enlisted in the Navy. This is the Navy's first all African-American crew. It was white officer, but it's an all-black crew. And a lot of those guys stayed in the Navy, and I believe one or two were on the gun crew that fired the last shell into the Alabama several years later. They were cheered and lauded as heroes by their family and friends when they left the fort. And it pointed out to them that the white crew mutiny, and a lot of you probably won't be coming back, but if you want to do this, volunteer. And they did. Because they never had the opportunity to ram, doesn't make them any less brave for having volunteered to do it. By the way, that is at the same time that Northern generals are getting slapped on the wrist for wanting to recruit black regiments. The Navy is allowed to get away with legal murder because Lincoln realizes the Navy needs its men one way or the other, and he knows it's going to work. The Secretary of the Navy sent his assistant down again and again to check on this crew. How are they doing? How are they doing? Which seems silly from our perspective, but it was an unknown at the time. They were doing just fine. So how were these fellows treated? Everyone else would join. Attitudes of white officers and enlisted men is interesting. Wells, of course, as I said, is a staunch abolitionist. He won't tolerate anything. The Navy officers, unlike Army officers who would have to wait years for this, they're the first to see actual conditions in the South. When you see maps of the Civil War, of course, you see that blue line slowly growing and sometimes shrinking and stuff like that. What it doesn't show you is that up every little navigable creek, until you hit a waterfall or shoal water, there should be little blue probing lines. There are rivers that stick like daggers into the heart of the South from all around the periphery, and the Navy is sending gunboats up there constantly. Within weeks of a state seceding, the Navy has gunboats up there. And this really rattles the Southerners, especially in South Carolina and Mississippi, because they're like, oh, the war is far away in Virginia. Terrible to be that, isn't it? And all of a sudden, someone's raiding their plantation because you're acting as a supply base for the local rebel army. So the Navy's reach is far, far greater than the Army's. What this means is that Navy officers on those gunboats are seeing slave conditions that no one in the North has actually witnessed. And several officers, DuPont, I think Keeler aboard the Monitor, they write home saying, I was always supporting the government in its decisions regarding slavery. I would not have done it had I seen what this is really, really like. So not only have a lot of Southern naval officers gone south, leaving most of the fleet abolitionists or Northern in their opinions, now they're seeing up close exactly what it is they're trying to end. Also, there's an influx of volunteer officers. There are only so many billets allotted by Congress to the number of ships in the fleet. And while the number of ships is expanding, career Navy officers are understandably and justifiably jealous of suddenly having to compete with a bazillion other officers at the end of the war. They want them to help in the war. When the war ends, it has to be totally understood that, okay, we're going back to the usual chain of promotion, all you guys are going home. So they accept acting volunteer officers. So a lot of times in the Navy, you'll see a high-ranking officer, but he's always an acting something, something, something. And at the end of the war, he's politely shown the door. That's the understanding. Well, a lot of these guys are coming from the Merchant Marine and the Whaling Fleet, both of which have been heavily integrated because they're rough jobs and they're always desperate for men. And while there's still racism on an individual basis, it's easy to find in the books. What you'll find is that these crews basically told everyone else, it really works. Don't worry about it. These guys can help you in a battle, help you in a storm. I kill what color his hand is. So again, there's individual racism, but there's no institutional bias, unlike in the Army. One little story I'll tell real quick. In 1863, I believe, USS Mystic sends a boat crew ashore in response to a woman waving a white flag. This is typical. There were Unions that wanted to escape the South. When they got close to shore, they were ambushed by Confederate infantry hiding in the bushes. This was a favorite Confederate trick, and it cost a lot of Navy lives. In this case, one of the sailors was killed, William Wilson, who was African American. And Wilson was left on the beach. He couldn't get off the beach in time and died. The other sailors, many of them were heavily wounded, made it back to the Mystic. And the captain said, we'll just shell them. We'll just kill them where they are. And they said, no, you might destroy Wilson's body. We want to go back and get him. Even the wounded guys insisted on going back to get their shipmate. So the captain loaded the boat up, put a second cover in the water, and they went in, muskets blazing. Cannonballs went over their heads and retrieved Wilson's body. They knew he was dead, but he was one of them. Now contrast this slide with the one I showed of the color sergeant when we started. Everyone gets the same clothing allotment. You get 2 suits of clothes every single year. You get the same food ration. By the way, the food ration in the Navy is far better than the Army. Scurvy is a typical Navy disease. The instances of scurvy in the Army are far greater than in the Navy at this point in time. You get the same medical care. I was so happy to find this picture of a hospital. Half the men are African American. You also get the exact same pay. Pay is something that's really interesting because you weren't actually given hard cash at the end of a month or whatever. Hard cash meant that I could pocket enough of that to jump ship and get my way home. Sell my uniform, buy a train ticket, I'm out of here. So you were never actually advanced money. If you went on liberty in some foreign port, the purser would figure, okay, 5 drinks, some entertainment, here's a couple bucks. That's all you're going to get. Navy pay is kept in a ledger. It's all abstract. How easy to cook the books. You go to leave at the end of your tour or the end of your cruise, they could have lied to everybody. No, everybody got the same pay, and it was all meticulous. You got the same bonuses. To serve on those black ironclads in South Carolina heat and humidity, you got a 25% bonus. Black or white, didn't matter. Same prize money. Up until World War I, when the practice ended, you got a chunk, a percentage of the value of a ship you captured, whether it was an enemy ship you sank or something that was bringing in illegal supplies, a blockade runner. And some of these were quite pricey. One powder monkey in 2 days' time on board the seagoing tug Aeolus got $3,000 period dollars. You multiply that by a factor of about 15 to make it modern money. And because there wasn't a battle, you know the kids just stand there twiddling his thumbs while the adults did the work. So admirals and everyone hired, they retired with gigantic, bankrolls. Everybody got the same prize money, and they made it retroactive to the year the war began, before it being clarified that blacks could receive in 1862. Also, the same treatment before the law. There's evidence in Massachusetts records actually that black sailors fared better than white sailors for the same offenses in the fleet. There's a wonderful little story here that again, you cannot help but conjure up how you think it's going to end. In 1864, aboard the USS Pampero, 2 sailors get in a fight. James Conlon, who's Irish, and James Dixon, who's African American. And they trade some name calling, not the ones you expect, mostly questioning each other's heritage and manner of birth, shall we say, or legality of birth. And when they start swinging punches, they're each giving as good as they got. And at one point, the African American sailor knocks down the Irish, just gets in a lucky punch. In falling, the Irish fellow hits his head on a stanchion on the deck and is killed. At this point, of course, everyone conjures up a rope. It's 1864 in white America. No, the Navy looked at this, took testimony, and decided this was a sailor's fight, it was fair, that was an accident, no charges. Told you it was different than the Army experience. Some of that prize money, by the way, the government took half of it right off the bat. And you would expect, what did the government do? We're going to enter grants administration, where's all money going to disappear to, what they do with all their half of it. What they actually did was invest it and get interest. And then they purchased retirement homes for soldiers and sailors. They didn't ask what race you were when you applied to go into one of these homes after the war. Everybody had access to the homes across the country. The number of African Americans will grow exponentially here. 2.5% at the start of the war. It more than almost triples there by 63. 15% is the accepted average for the whole war. But notice in the Mississippi Squadron, where you had a lot of contraband slaves escaping to the fleet, it's 34%. By 1865, it widows back down to 17. But even at the end of the war, it's still 6 times the pre-war average. So the Navy has just accepted everybody, anybody in the fleet. How did the African Americans perform in combat? It's less a question of how they performed, which was flawlessly, and more, what were they allowed to do? Now again, we'll contrast this with the Army. In the Navy, there's no safe place on one of these ships. I have read stories where a crew will take the youngest powder monkey, knowing they're going to a nasty battle, and say, stay in this cabin, you'll be safe, get under the bed. Damned if it's not the one place a shell comes and kills the kid. You just can't predict it. These boats would look like Swiss cheese after a battle. The Army had especially trained several black regiments at the Battle of Siege of Petersburg. They were going to blow up the crater, if you're not familiar with this. They turned under the rebel trenches, put a massive amount of explosives in there, and we're going to touch it off. And when the dust settled, they figured, okay, those guys are going to literally be shot. They won't be able to defend themselves. We will rush over there with several black regiments who've been specially trained. They had scaling ladders. They were told what to expect. They were good to go. And at the last second, Grant thought, if they get slaughtered, I'm going to be charged with having sent them to their death. No, we'll put in white regiments. Well, the white regiments have been told pretty much an hour before you're going to do this. So they were just as scatterbrained as the rebels were, and it was a slaughter. They went into the crater, it became just a slaughter pen. The rebels recovered and just shot down into it, and to make it even worse, they then sent in the trained black regiments, who couldn't even get to the far side of the Sierra Matters. So the Army is terrified of actually using black soldiers en masse. There is no way to keep a black sailor out of harm's way in a battle. Everybody fights. They filled every single enlisted building, including 100 deck petty officers, which gives them command authority over their gun crews. There are many petty officers in the fleet who are African American, but they're staff petty officers. Stewards could be petty officers, anyone that didn't have command authority. There's at least 100 of these guys who actually had authority on deck. 7 of these men earned the Medal of Honor. There was an additional danger for these fellows if they were captured. Oftentimes the rebels would simply hang or shoot black sailors on the riverbank. This was witnessed many, many times. Sometimes when we would send a ship up a small river or something and have a majority black crew, we would stuff it with extra Marines just to repel any boarders, give them an edge in the fight. Wells was infuriated by the fact that they were killing sailors outright, and a lot of them seemed to be disappearing into Confederate prison camps and never coming out. He ordered his own local officers to set up cartels out of sight, out of mind from Washington. Stanton, the Secretary of War, was very jealous of getting back soldiers. He didn't want to see sailors return. Those guys didn't help him. As it was hard for Wells to get any sailors back. And whenever Stanton put his foot down and said, I need soldiers, to hell with their sailors, Wells again went to his local officers and said, you go ashore and talk to the Rebs. We'll swap them sailor for sailor. And by the way, if they kill any more black sailors, we're going to start doing it to Confederate sailors. That practice stopped pretty quick. So what happened after the war, after this record? Aryanism, I was saddened to find, is not a Nazi word, it's not a German word, it starts over here. After the war, Jim Crow laws kick in, and we basically suffered massive amnesia. There are still blacks in the fleet, all the way up to the beginning of the next century. The problem is that their contributions were totally overlooked and forgotten about. What's more, the Navy becomes more mechanical. This really isn't the Navy's fault per se. All the old sail handling skills, the manning and management, if you will, of a wooden sailing ship, those were skills that you could learn on the job or at home. Carpentry skills at home or carpentry skills on board a ship. You could learn the ropes pretty easily. In becoming more mechanical, it became difficult because Jim Crow laws forbade blacks from learning those skills. So the Navy wasn't saying, no, we don't want you because you're not white. We can't take you because you don't have the skills we need for you to serve in the Navy. Also, there actually were black midshipmen at the Naval Academy right after the war, but they were counted out. Again, I'll point out, after the war, when we united the country again, you have a lot of Southern Navy officers coming back into the fleet. And so this attitude hardens quite a bit. The number of African Americans in the fleet drops further and further. By the beginning of World War II, they're restricted really to messmates. Part of this is that we found somebody else to treat badly. Once we acquired the Philippines, the Navy preferred Filipinos, as did the Army, as servants. Best theory I heard was that they were smaller of stature and so considered more docile. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but the numbers don't lie. Happily, World War II, things turned around. The Navy actually integrated, I think a year before true order went on deck. And right after the war, we had our first black officer, Wesley Brown, graduate the academy, and gravely becomes the first admiral. I think there's been 49 black admirals since that time. So how does this all fall out of the history books? Well, for one, it's part of the overall Navy story. Notice the 26 grim-faced soldiers there and the one crazy sailor in the back. That ratio, happily, is spot on. This GAR picture is from the town I live in North Attleboro. And by God, you're going to notice Michael Harvey. If I had to stick somebody and make him scream, you're going to notice I'm back there. Well, Harvey can't write near as much as those 26 other guys. And that ratio obtains across the board. So, as the point I made this point before, the Navy story gets lost in the sea of Army aid. It's not really malicious, it's a numbers game, and there are a lot more of them than there are of us. That's why these talks are so neat. But it goes further than that. In addition to Navy history and researching history, I worked for years as a graphic designer, and just as they say nowadays, words matter, so do pictures. You don't realize how much images are burned into your brain, especially as a little kid. I went looking for integrated statues and of the Navy from the Civil War. These are the only two I could find that actually showed integrated crews. And you can say that the guy on the left is, depicted in a stereotypical fashion, and the guy on the right is kneeling. Does that suggest subservience? I look at these and say, maybe so, but they're part of a crew, and they're doing a job. And they're doing the job they were asked to do, and nobody is shucking or, anything like that. Images is a point I want to make by going back a little further in history. I'll show you how subversive this is. And again, not intentional, but we all play a part of it subconsciously. Right after the battle on the lakes, a year later, a guy named Kelly or Baldwin depicted Perry crossing from the Lawrence to Niagara with his "Don't Give Up the Ship" flag and things like that. And he knew from records there were 4 sailors and Perry. He stuck in the little kid, which is Alexander, Perry's nephew, because God, that just tugged at your heartstrings. We actually know that Alexander, if he was in the battle at all, we're not sure that, was tucked away in a safe place back on the Lawrence. But he's here trying to get his uncle to get down, don't get shot, uncle, I love you too much. That's how it's depicted. All the sailors are white. Despite the fact that 50% of Perry's crew is black, and Perry didn't care what color you were. By the end of the war, Thomas Birch has doubled the size of the crew because 4 just doesn't seem impressive. He has taken Alexander on at least. He's been sending him home. But again, they're all white. In 1865, this is the most telling painting. William Powell is tasked with painting a mural for the state office in Ohio. And his depiction is pretty accurate. He has too big of a crew. There's one African American there, and at least one fellow wounded in the water, and another guy up there. It's not 50%, but at least there are non-white sailors present, so at least makes that point. In 1873, someone in the Senate sees that painting of Ohio, likes it enough that they want to have it put up on the Senate side of the House down in Washington, and Powell is tasked to paint this picture. It's changed a little. We've now lost one African American, guy in the water's still there, added a white sailor, and left the guy in the boat. Now, supposedly, and this is the depressing thing that, oops, back up one there, jumping the gun. The black sailor there, it was believed, was put in intentionally, and they said, oh, it's Hannibal, it's his servant. We think he's been put in there as a sop to emancipation, because that just happened. No one looked at the actual records that said half the crew, was African American. Now, in 1911, we're ending one of our more racist periods. All the black sailors are gone. The crew is still gigantic like that, but at least Alexander is still, tucked on the way to bed where he's supposed to be. We bring back this image in 2013 for a forever stamp. You'll notice the sailor in the water is gone. The sailor up top is gone. There's one black sailor left there, and it's at this point that the government in 2013 said that we think the guy's name is Hannibal. And, how they put it, that his presence reflects more the mood after the Civil War, meaning emancipation, than the reality of 1812. They got the reality of 1812 totally wrong. This painting is a lot more accurate. In 1943, Martha Schweik was a little bit of rabble-rouser, shall we say. She would later be accused, I think, of socialist leanings in McCarthy and stuff like that. But she painted a lot of images for the WPA. I don't know where or how or when she did her research, but based on what evidence we have, this is probably the most accurate picture. There were 4 sailors and old Cyrus. 4 trusted sailors and old Cyrus. The African American here, we know, had known Perry his entire life. Cyrus had served as a fifer in the Revolutionary War. Cyrus is pushing 80 at this time, so old Cyrus is a serious name. He was Perry's friend. He had never been his servant. He was never his slave. He lived in Taunton, Massachusetts near Perry and is buried there with his family. And he had been aboard pretty much every ship Perry ever commanded. He went with him. This is where you get the idea of Alexander from. Someone way back when said, oh, one of the sailors was trying to protect him with his body. Well, for one, Alexander's not going to stop much. He's a scrawny little kid. Cyrus is the one who put his body between his CO and his friend in enemy fire. Cyrus Tiffany is his full name, who used his body to protect Perry. Again, Alexander was nowhere to be seen. We also know the name of one of the other black sailors, either Jesse Williams or Newport Hasman. This is the painting that should have been on our stamps, but instead, we reprised that Powell painting from 1873, and everyone who sees the stamps just assumes there weren't any blacks in the fleet. It's the furthest from the truth you can possibly get. And I'll show you how ingrained this gets. A couple years ago, I was invited to give a Navy talk to a high school class in Lynn, Massachusetts. Very, very diverse community. You name me a race, there was somebody in that room. And before the class started, I was in a Navy uniform just to give them an idea of what it looked like. And a white teacher thought he was making a joke and says to me, so what's the white guy doing teaching black history? And I just said, it's American history. he just shut up. And when his class came in, I gave the talk, and they're typical teenagers, you know, someone maybe braiding the hair of a girl in front of him, or looking on his phone, stuff like that. I remember one kid was sort of like, asleep. It was the kid that was asleep that got me, because something I said caught his eye or his ear. And he looked up, and he saw a picture of a black sailor. And he said, there were people like me. Yeah, there were. That's the point of trying to make this whole talk. Do you have any questions? Yes, sir.
What were some of your sources of material?
I can send you those. The file is about this thick, printed out on letter-sized paper. This information is all out there, but you have to go digging. And I'll caution you, if you do go digging, take everything with a grain of salt. By that I mean, like I said, no institutional bias, but individual racism. I have authors who I think are doing a great job, but they will zone in on 6 or 7 episodes of racism, hazing, beatings, things like that, and extrapolate out the whole fleet. You can't do that. Then there are other ones that will, find records from a ship where everything went on fine and extrapolate that to the whole fleet. No, it's always different on a case-by-case, ship-by-ship basis. My point is that unlike the Army, the Navy did not descend to an institutional bias against anyone of color.
You've used the phrase African American throughout the talk.
Yeah.
At one point you talked about there being everything on the planet there. Wasn't in fact 90%, 95% black African Americans? There wasn't in fact the whole mixed crew of people from around the world?
Most of the ships had people from all around the world. I mean, the majority of the crews are white northerners, all right? Merchant Marine, whaling fleet, Navy. 15 or 34% down south could be African American. But it was not unusual to find Asians in the fleet, Canadians, you would find a lot of Germans in the fleet. Interesting little side story, at the beginning of the war, whenever we weren't sure we were gonna get people enough to man the ships, one of the German states actually offered to send Lincoln 5,000 German sailors. Of course, Lincoln just heard Hessians in his head and decided not to do that. But you could have had a fleet speaking German, So yeah, our crews were totally ethnically mixed. And again, I'm not trying to say that the Navy was forward-looking or politically correct. They're desperate for men. If you could fog a mirror, you're in the fleet. But the happy circumstance is it proved integrated fleets could work.
What happened to Wells, the Secretary of the Navy? Did he continue in his position? Was he given any credit for this, as largely speaking?
Not really, because again, after the war, we had national amnesia. To be pragmatic, whenever slaves were freed, yes, that affected the job pool. So a lot of people in the North didn't want to see competition. There was actually, during the war, I think it was Indiana, Illinois. Illinois had actually forbidden any relocation of freed slaves into its own territory because they knew that would take away farming jobs from their day laborers who were away fighting the war. So yeah, it did upset the balance a bit. So we got pretty much hard-hearted about integrating that into society. And that's why some of you were forced to stay in the South, it was all slavery again, sharecropping and all that. And when Jim Crow comes along and forbids them from learning new skills, it just keeps them in a position that's terribly hard to get out of. Wells goes back to Connecticut. He's active in politics for a while, but I think the war just exhausted everybody. He didn't write about this aspect of it. I'm spitballing here, but I think he just figured I did the right thing. I don't need any reward or recognition. It was the right thing to do. Again, it was a happy circumstance. So many Southern officers had left to go fight with the Southern Navies, and the Northern officers were the first to see the real conditions. So the Navy is really the first section of a Northern American society to recognize what really needed to be done. Yes, sir.
Did the Southern Navy press African American slaves into service?
Not on any large scale. I don't recall any Southern sailors per se. You've obviously got Robert Smalls and the planter. He's sailor enough to know how to steal that boat and get the devil on
Yes.
Charleston Harbor and all that.
Yes.
But no, they no more impressed black sailors than the silly stories you hear about black regiments. That's all wannabe BS. That, do you find an occasional black with a rifle aimed at a Yankee, maybe helping to defend, the white guy that owns him? Yeah, you can find that, but that doesn't extrapolate out to regiments of, colored troops coming to fight the Northerners. No, there aren't black crewed ships in the South at all.
What impact did the whaling industry locally, New Bedford, Nantucket, have in providing African American sailors to the Union Navy?
I I think a large percentage of the guys in this area that served in the fleet came from the whaling industry. Because the whaling industry was actually in decline even before the Civil War. They were being threatened by what they called rock oil, which we call oil. At one point, just before the war, there were actually storage tanks of rock oil in New Bedford that, I don't know whalers knew how it happened, but they burned one night, you know? Their industry was in decline. The whaling industry pretty much exhausted a lot of the schools. And also, whenever the rebels were at the end of the war, devastated the fleet up in the Bering Straits. There was really no rebounding from that. It went on for a little while longer. But I think a lot of those guys went looking for work in the fleet. I know there's one fellow that I won't get into the details of how I'm looking into, a guy named Tom Cooper, who was from Martha's Vineyard. He's American Indian, but he left the whaling fleet, which had been his career, served in the Navy for 4 or 5 years, and then tried to get back in the whaling fleet after the war. So yeah, I think a lot of those guys left the declining whaling industry and went into the Navy. So yes, a big impact. Did I see a question up here?
What happened after World War II with the Navy and the Coast Guard? Were they very few what?
Well, legally, they weren't supposed to integrate until right after World War II. After that, they were integrated. And I know just anecdotally from my father, from friends who served in the 60s and that, yeah, their crews were integrated. There was no more color line.
Very slow.
Very slow, I'm sure. Well, for one thing, if I'm African American, I'm not sure I want to put myself in that situation, because you don't know what you're ever into.
Yeah.
It's hard to kill some of these ideas, or change people's minds. But I think research like this is important, because it's not like, I want to be part of history too. These guys were part of history. We just didn't know it. I'm not rewriting any history books. This isn't revisionist history. This is correctionist history. There's a big, big difference there. I can document everything I just told you, everything I just said. It's all there in the history books. If you believe Pickett's charts, there's no more or less reason to believe this stuff. So what the people at the time all wrote. Any other questions, folks? Yes, sir.
Just a comment, you showed a picture of Gravely when I was here in the piers in the early 60s, mid-60s. He was a squadron commander, and to see a four-striper black officer, there weren't just a lot of them.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I remember that too.
Two related questions. In the Royal Navy, even in the early 19th century, they started doing anti-slavery missions. And any black slave that came aboard a Royal Navy ship was instantly free. So did the Union Navy do that? And secondly, there are these stories of using black seamen, this is on the Royal Navy side, and choosing them in certain cases to be major parts of boarding parties because of the psychological impact of these crazed, armed black people coming over the bulwark. Or at least, on the victim. And given treatment on the Confederate side, were they sometimes used that way as well?
Okay, we did have, first question. We'll go back to the anti-slavery patrols. When the British abolished slavery in 1806, I think it was, we joined in a couple of decades after that in providing ships for slavery patrols off the west coast of Africa. We weren't forbidding slavery back in the good old US, we were forbidding the importation of slaves. I don't know how effective that was because you still had southern ships running slaves in right up to the beginning of the war. Whenever we capture a ship like that, my impression always was, and I've not researched this in detail, was we sent it back to the mainland, which means they probably get captured again and sent to the next ship, but I don't think they're instantly freeing them, unless that counted as such. As far as boarding goes, no, the Union Navy didn't do that. When you are assigned a position in the Navy at this time, it's a little confusing to explain or understand. I might have a position on a gun crew, but I also have 2 or 3 other numbers memorized in my head. And if boarders are called for, and my boarding number is the one they call, one guy from every other gun or something will go armed with boarding weapons and go over the side. If there's a fire somewhere, they'll call out a different number. Maybe my buddy over here and 3 other guys are somewhere way to fight the fire. That way you're not taking everyone off a gun crew, but it's total randomness what you're assigned. There's no white or black to it at all. There's also not all that many boarding action in the Civil War. I'm not saying they wouldn't have tried that tactic, but it might have backfired in this case. Southerners were absolutely infuriated whenever the North began fielding black soldiers. There is a battle I'm researching now, but written about before, the Battle of Fort Butler down in Donaldsonville, Louisiana. there's very good evidence that, again, I found in a Navy logbook. No one found it in 150 years because no one checks the logbooks. But a Navy officer aboard the gunboat Princess Royal just notes idly, this morning a troop ship came from New Orleans and offloaded some black soldiers. So I've got at least a squad of black soldiers in Fort Butler. On the very eve of the battle, it's a night attack. The Confederate officer comes to the gates of the fort, does the math for Major Bullen of Maine, who's in there with 200 sick soldiers, and says, we're going to steamroll you guys. I'm paraphrasing. He happens to see what he believes are black soldiers on the parapet. Now, it is getting dark. They might have been guys from Maine for all I know he couldn't see. It might have also been the Black Regiment. In any event, he believes the fort is manned by black soldiers. He is so furious, because we're actually 2 weeks away before, no, it's only been 2 weeks since we first employed them at Port Hudson, and nobody is aware that this has happened. He is so incensed, he immediately says, no quarter. I will not be able to control my men when they find out you have black soldiers in there, which terrifies Major Bullen. He actually goes to the gunboat and says, can you evacuate us, because we're going to die. The Navy officer instead ran sailors and teach them how to use the cannon they have, and they survived the attack. But my point is, I think if you boarded a Confederate ship with all black sailors, it might actually end up bad for the black sailors. I can't describe how infuriating this was for Southerners to think that we would dare do that. One, to be attacked or assaulted by what they consider to be an inferior human, and secondly, obviously you're promoting servile insurrection against us. It was infuriating, doesn't capture everything, so I don't think it would work, personally. I would not want to been a movement. Other questions, folks? Yes? Blake?
Can you tell us about the artwork on the screen?
This is from the African American Museum down in Washington, D.C. You mean just this one or the whole show?
Yeah, that one.
Yeah, that fellow was on the African American Museum statue out in the entryway to it. Again, I guess that'd be the third statue I could find with African Americans in it. It is interesting how subtle this is. This research made me stop and think of places I've been as a kid, and going through different government buildings and that, and looking at the pictures. And again, history has been whitewashed a great deal. Even when someone, did it correctly originally, everyone of color seems to drop out as you go through time. And you get that impression up here. And so someone who was firm in that belief, as was I was just a normal, white American kid, sucking in all the pictures, not realizing that I was building an impression because of that. And when I started reading this, it's like, well then, no one ever, there's no government mandate, no mandate from any organization said, by the way, wipe everybody out. But it just happens over time. I do journal edits for the Journal of the Company of Military Historians. And I don't know if any of you are members or not, but one of their founders did a whole series of pictures you all would recognize. I call him G.I. Joe. He always used himself as a model and beefed himself up and made him clean shaven, steel jawed, stuff like that. But it's all uniform plates from throughout American history. And with the exception of one showing guys in Vietnam and one showing a black regiment in World War I, every single one is all white soldiers. Even from the Revolution, even from War of 1812, even the Navy War of 1812, they're always all white men. So I don't know if that was blatant or subtle or ignorant racism, but you get the impression, it's an all white history book. And you start to realize, that's wrong. That's wrong. All set then? Thank you all very much.